My name is David Maimon, and I'm a professor in the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice in the University of Maryland. And my area of research focuses on cybercrime. What I do is I study the human players that drive this phenomenon, specifically the offenders, the legitimate users of computers or the internet, as well as the IT managers. And so today I decided to share with you guys some interesting findings, I think, from a study that I conducted with my colleagues in the University of Maryland, and that have something to do with big data. And that research focuses on public Wi-Fi. In public Wi-Fi users and the traffic they generate over public Wi-Fi hotspots. So a key generator of big data are public Wi-Fi networks. Internet traffic and the packets that travel over these networks could be collected and analyzed using big data analytic tools in order to try and understand how users of those networks employ the network and how they expose themselves to different types of cybercrime. I think that security scholars should spend more time thinking about public Wi-Fi networks, because at the end of the day, they are very good platforms for hackers to use, both for generating attacks as well as attacking public Wi-Fi network users. So the project that we'll be discussing here today, I envision guiding future efforts to collect big data in public Wi-Fi networks in order to really try and improve security postures of both users as well as the network providers. So the project that I will be discussing here today, its major goal is to really understand what kind of cues could be embedded in the environment in order to nudge public Wi-Fi users to apply both offline and online security behaviors when using the network. In general, public Wi-Fi, as I assume the majority of our viewers know, are really useful and good networks for folks to log in without providing any username or passwords, and very great networks that could be used for pretty much everything. They allow users to log into the internet from anywhere, at any time of day, and most often those public Wi-Fi networks allow folks to do pretty much whatever they want and access any type of website they would like to access using those networks as platform. They're very common all over the globe, and they're heavily used by users who bring their laptops, smartphone devices, tablets, or whatever device that could be connected to the network and used to surf the internet. Because public Wi-Fi networks are, they support the use of legitimate users, the anonymity aspect is very important in this sense. They also support the use of illegitimate users of the internet and allow them access to the internet. Hackers found a lot of advantages of using public Wi-Fi networks. Many hackers prefer, in fact, to use public Wi-Fi networks in order to generate attacks on other computers, because at the end of the day, you can't really track those hackers if they use those hotspots to generate attacks on other computers, on their websites, whatever the target of attack is. So they're very popular among hackers who are trying to generate attacks on, the general public, but they're also popular among hackers who are trying to target public Wi-Fi users. There are a few risks that I should mention here in the context of public Wi-Fi. The first is a type of attack that is called a man-in-the-middle attack. In this kind of attack, an attacker situates himself between a victim and the computer that the target is trying to access, and simply route all the traffic through the computer or router that allows him to sort of that allow the target to connect, to the internet. Once doing this, the hacker can get access to all of the information that is traveling over the offender router. And so this is a major risk because sometimes we access servers and access information that we don't really want other people to take a look at. And during a man-in-the-middle attack, attackers may get access to all this information. Another type of attack that is fairly popular and could target public Wi-Fi users is malware. There are a couple of studies and a couple of reports that suggest that malware likes to inject malware on public Wi-Fi network, and specifically worms. And those worms travel over the network, infect computers, and try to travel to other public Wi-Fi networks as well. So this is the second risk that public Wi-Fi users take when using those platforms for accessing the internet, getting infected by malware. The last risk is a risk that people are aware of but not really pay a lot of attention to, and that is the risk of shoulder surfing. When we talk about shoulder surfing, we're talking about somebody looking behind you to see what you're doing on your computer screen. So, if you're on Facebook or you're dealing with sensitive information on public Wi-Fi network, on Starbucks or any coffee house for that matter, somebody can be, behind you, looking behind your shoulder, taking a picture of your computer screen in order to really get some information about you. So because of those risks and in an effort to address those risks, security experts propose a few ways through which cybersecurity or that users could apply self-protective behaviors when using those networks. The first recommendation by cybersecurity expert is to really apply security solutions when using public Wi-Fi networks. One of the most common security solution that is encouraged by security experts is remote VPN. This tool, once you download it to your computer and turn it on every time you use a public Wi-Fi network to access other websites, simply encrypt the traffic from your computer to the server and make it very difficult for an offender to see the traffic that your computer generates, your computer send and receive. So simply apply a security solution is one way through which you can protect yourself when using public Wi-Fi network. Another way is to protect privacy. Simply look around to see that nobody's behind you, taking pictures of your screen, recording your computer activity, recording your traffic. You use public Wi-Fi network over a restaurant or a coffee house or even in an airport. The last recommendation, this is a really interesting recommendation, I have to admit, that is proposed by several cybersecurity experts, calls for avoiding accessing and providing sensitive information over public Wi-Fi networks. In other words, this recommendation suggests that public Wi-Fi users, should not really access sensitive websites, sort of speaking, from public Wi-Fi networks. So you shouldn't really go to your banking account. you shouldn't check your banking account using public Wi-Fi network. You shouldn't really go on Facebook. You shouldn't really go on other websites in which you have to provide sensitive information. And the thing is that they're trying to prevent is from a potential offender accessing or getting some exposure to your data. So these are some of the recommendations that I was able to find out there that some cybersecurity experts came up with in order to sort of encourage public Wi-Fi users to apply self-protective online behavior when using public Wi-Fi. And what interests me is really to discover ways to nudge public Wi-Fi users to apply those security solutions when using public Wi-Fi networks. Okay, but the question is, what do people really pay attention to when using public Wi-Fi, and whether we can use whether they pay attention to in order to trigger their engagement in self-protective behaviors. At the end of the day, when you use public Wi-Fi, your attention is divided to two environments, the cyber environment as well as the physical environment. And we really need to understand as scholars those two environments and what people pay attention to in those environments if we want to nudge people to be more safe over the internet, and particularly when using public Wi-Fi network. And so in our research, we are really trying to find those cues that people will pay attention to. And our premise is that people are situationally aware. Okay? People are situationally aware to what happens around them. And, of course, different people will have a different level of situational awareness. Situational awareness, just to make sure that we're all on the same page and respect this concept, is being mindful of the surrounding and identifying potential threats and dangerous situations. The assumption is that if you are aware to the environment, you can respond to it. Your level of awareness will determine, whether you will become the victim of crime or not. And we assume that if we embed different cues in the environment, we can trigger people involvement in an application of self-protective behaviors in cyberspace. Self-protective behaviors and security behaviors have been discussed in the information science literature quite recently, but in the context of the chronological literature, some people talked about, some scholars talked about the value of self-protective behavior in reducing the probability of individuals to experience different types of crime, mainly, I have to say, violent crime. Some of the self-protective behaviors that criminologists identified include beating or scratching or kicking when somebody is trying to attack you, and those kind of self-protective behavior will be considered as forceful resistance. But there are also non-forceful resistance that criminologists discussed when thinking about individual probability to become the victim of crime under specific circumstances. And one of the most common non-forceful resistant behavior that could prevent you from becoming a victim of crime is simply avoiding dangerous situation, running away from environment that may expose you to different types of crime. And so, based on this assumption, the first research hypothesis that I will come up with in this talk suggests that individuals who are situationally aware to the presence of people around them are more likely to apply online and offline self-protective behaviors when using public Wi-Fi networks. So if you're aware to what's happening around you, you will be more likely to apply online and offline self-protective behaviors. When we talk about online self-protective behaviors, we can think about avoiding accessing websites like banking websites, email websites, and so on. When we're talking about offline self-protective behaviors, we're talking about people concealing their computer screens. And so to test this research question and really try to gauge the level of situational awareness people report in the context of public Wi-Fi environment and in general, we put together a survey. It was a student survey. The aim of the survey was to really understand how individuals make use of technology, their experience with cyber victimization, and any experiences with cyber offending that they had. The sample included 836 undergraduate students in a large American university. And some of the questions that we incorporated in that survey allow us to understand or answer the research question as well as sort of test the research hypothesis we came up with. When we try to understand situational awareness as well as online and offline self-protective behaviors, we put together the following list of dependent variables. In the context of self-protective online behavior, we simply asked students to report whether they check their personal online accounts, such as banking account or email accounts over a public Wi-Fi network, and we asked them to report whether they do that or not. And we also asked students whether they conceal their device screen when using public Wi-Fi network. And again, for this question, it was a Likert scale we used that ranges from 1 to 5, with 1 being never and 5 being always. With respect to our key independent variable in this research, we focused on situational awareness, and we simply asked people whether they are situationally aware to their surrounding when using public Wi-Fi. The score for that item ranged from 1, which indicated not aware at all, to 5, which indicated very aware. And when we ran statistical models, we ran a logic model for the first dependent variable and negative binomial to the second, we found that situational awareness reduces individual likelihood to check personal online accounts over public Wi-Fi, while increasing their probability to conceal their computer screen when using such network. So that is a very important indication that situational awareness play a very important role in determining individual likelihood to engage in both online and offline self-protective behavior. Now, once we understand that situational awareness is key, we try to identify some of the things in the environment that could be used and could be leveraged to push people to be more secure over the internet and apply both online and offline self-protective behavior. So the next question we tried to answer was whether the type of people in the environment matter for the willingness to engage in self-protective behavior. So, what kind of people in the environment, the type of people in the environment will increase the probability of individuals to engage in both online and offline self-protective behavior. So, based on the criminological literature, we believe that place managers will probably play a very important role in increasing folks' probability to engage in self-protective behavior. Think about it. I mean, if you're in an environment and somebody is attacking somebody is behaving violently towards you or trying to rob you, we assume that you will be more likely to engage in self-protective behavior and resist. So, use power if you see somebody that can help you in the corner, like a police officer, or somebody who's working in a specific place. On the other hand, you look around and you see random people, then it could be that you feel less comfortable engaging in self-protective behavior because you would maybe think that they will participate and will further victimize you. However, based on protective motivation theory, the threat of the situation and the threat that you feel in specific circumstances will determine whether you will or will not engage in self-protective behavior. If, according to protective motivation theory, you will feel very much threatened by the individual around you, by the type of individual around you, then you will be more likely to engage in self-protective behavior than if you will not feel threatened by those individuals. So what we essentially tried to answer was whether the percentage of place manager in those public Wi-Fi networks that we all go to really has something to do with public Wi-Fi users' probability or likelihood to engage in online and offline self-protective behavior. The research hypothesis we came up with suggested that the higher the percentage of place manager in a public hotspot location, then either the lower or higher the probability of self-protective behavior being employed by computer users will be. Again, based on the theoretical rationale you're going with, protection motivation or the criminological theories that we are familiar with. So to answer this research question and test this research hypothesis, we engaged in another study. And in this study, what we did was we launched a quasi-experimental one-group post-test only research design in which we sent students to different hotspots, locations across the state of Maryland with our own hotspots. The students brought with them their own hotspot. Our hotspot name was UMD private or Davy private. It will depend on the configuration. And what we essentially tried to figure out was whether people would log in to our network or not. If people would have logged into our network, we assume that this behavior will be very unsafe. And so that will indicate that people are not really engaging in online self-protective behaviors in a specific place. Next to situating those devices 3 times a day in 102 public Wi-Fi locations in the state of Maryland, the student we sent also took notes and diagrammed everything that took place in the hotspot location. The students took notes with respect to the number of male and female in the location. The student took note with respect to the way people were sitting next to each other. They took notes with respect to the number of laptops that they were able to see in the premise, the number of smartphones. They took notes with respect to the number of people who were coming in and out. And they put together in a diagram that I hope you guys can see now. We took all this information and we coded it to our data set really in order to try and figure out the proportion of people who conceal their computer screen in the public Wi-Fi location, as well as the proportion of employees and customer in the locations. This is how we thought we will be able to answer this research question and validate our research hypothesis. So, with respect to our dependent variable, we had 2 dependent variables in this study. The first was simply to identify traffic that was recorded on our honeypot Wi-Fi. The assumption is that if in a specific location people logged into our Wi-Fi and used it, that was an indication of unsecure, unsafe online behavior. So we simply took measures for that. And then we also calculated the percent of computer devices concealed in the location. With respect to our independent variable, remember what we're trying to figure out is whether the presence of place managers in the context of our hotspot, we're focusing specifically on employees, We're trying to assess the relationship between the presence of place managers and online and offline self-protective behavior. So simply calculate the percentage employees in the hotspot and assess the relationship between this key independent variable and our two dependent variable. And what we found was that the percentage of employees in the public Wi-Fi location was highly associated with both online and offline self-protective behavior. With respect to logging into our network, we find that the higher the proportion of employees in the location, the less likely individual were to log into our public Wi-Fi network, to the hotspot that we brought with us. So, higher the proportion of employees, the more likely people were to be more secure on public Wi-Fi hotspots. We also found that the higher proportion of employees in the premise, the more likely people were to conceal their computer screen. So again, this is an indication for an offline self-protective behavior. So higher proportion of employees increases the probability of people to conceal their computer screen and be safer on the network. So in conclusion, we suggest that individuals who are situationally aware of the presence of people around them are more likely to apply online and offline self-protective behaviors. And we also suggest that the higher the percentage of employees in public hotspot location, the higher the probability of self-protective behavior being employed by computer users. Now, the major question is, so what? So what? We find this really interesting pattern. What's the value of it? So I think that big data really gets into this answer in a meaningful way. We believe that if we continue collecting data about what happens in the environment, both the online and offline environment, we collect a massive amount of information of how people are using the network and how they expose themselves to different attacks. We will be able to tie that information with environmental cues, both on the online and offline environment, that will nudge them to be more secure over the internet when using public Wi-Fi network. Now, in the example I gave today, we used information from 800 students as well as 102 public Wi-Fi locations. But I think that if we want to come up with a more effective security policies with respect to public Wi-Fi networks users, how they should use the network, as well as the tools that can protect those networks, we need to generate some evidence that will indicate that those cues are really effective and could nudge people in the right direction. In order to do that, we need to collect more data from more places, use tools that will allow us to investigate what happens over those networks. And I assume that big data analytic tools will be crucial in that sense. So with that in mind, thank you very much, and hopefully you enjoyed my time on this really interesting event. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Eitan Diamond. Glad to be joining you for this live streaming event. I'm going to be talking about big data and implementation of the law of armed conflict. And as this title suggests, I'm going to be presenting some thoughts about ways in which technologies capable of capturing and analyzing large volumes of data and metadata might affect the implementation of the law of armed conflict. To coordinate expectations, I'll note from the outset that I'll only be offering some preliminary observations, suggesting avenues for further exploration rather than any finished work. Also, I'm going to be touching on some of many relevant issues. I want, for example, be talking about big data's implication on the regulation of cyber warfare, and there's a lot to be said about that. I also want to more than hint at its relevance for the regulation of autonomous weapon systems, again, an area that's open to a great deal of research and speculation. What I do want to do is to present some observations about common features of contemporary armed conflict as a starting point. Armed conflicts as they unfold in physical space, about the possible impact that big data might have on such conflict environments, and to then consider what this might mean for the application of the law of armed conflict. So I'll begin then with those features of armed conflict that I referred to. And the first of these is one that dates back to time immemorial. It's captured by the expression the fog of war. And it has to do with the fact that armed conflicts are complex collaborative enterprises. They involve many moving pieces, moving over an extended area. For a warring party, there's going to be an effort to try and coordinate between those various moving pieces, moving on its behalf, its personnel, all the means of warfare that it's operating, and this can be challenging. It becomes more challenging when they have to, at the same time, try to uncover what the opposing party is trying to do and hide what it's doing from the opposing party. So there's a lot going on, and the picture isn't very clear for those involved in armed conflicts generally. They're making life and death decisions, really dramatic decisions, under high pressure, in this foggy situation where information isn't very clear, and that poses many challenges. The second feature, and this is a characteristic of contemporary armed conflicts, increasingly a characteristic of those conflicts, has to do with the fact that armed conflicts, and this in a way contradicts the previous observation, they generate a huge volume of data. Increasingly, conflicts nowadays take place in densely populated areas, in cities and urban environments, rather than in an open battlefield. It's very rare nowadays to have two opposing parties clashing on an open battlefield. Instead, they operate in and among civilians and civilian infrastructure. You can think, for example, of the conflict now taking place in Syria. That conflict is generating a tremendous amount of information. The information comes from the belligerent parties. They don't necessarily share that with the public at large, but they have devices that are documenting in various ways what's occurring in the conflict zone. So they have satellites and drones and all sorts of other mechanisms to document what's going on. But there are also civilians on the ground recording their experiences, either intentionally or just by using their smartphones, etc. They're producing a lot of data that's relevant to understanding the conflict environment. And some of that data is being mined by the belligerent parties. Now, I said this contrasts the fog of war because you suddenly have this mass of information, but that's not necessarily the case because having a lot of information doesn't necessarily offer a clearer picture. Sometimes a lot of information can just cause great confusion. And I refer here to the expression vignettes because in a way that's what you often have. You have, say, a piece of footage filmed by a civilian with their smartphone in the street. Then you have satellite imagery or drone imagery documenting another aspect of the conflict, etc., etc. You have all these little bits of information, these little stories uncovering one element from a particular perspective of the conflict, but that doesn't necessarily come together to tell a coherent story. It's very difficult to actually make sense of so much data, certainly for human beings. But the technologies that we now have at our disposal are capable of capturing and sifting through and making sense of all this big data. And this carries potential to perhaps lift the fog of war, to make sense of information and to understand what's happening more clearly. And this has many repercussions for the warring parties' capacity to wage successful military campaigns. It actually operates in various time zones. So on the one hand, it enables the parties to gather key intelligence about the enemy and also to better coordinate between their own forces. It enhances the ability to document and analyze what occurred on the battlefield beforehand, so looking to the past. But it also provides a clearer vision of the battle space in the present, so you know what happened beforehand, and that can be crucial for planning ahead, but also where everyone is at this moment. And perhaps more dramatically, algorithms detecting patterns hidden in big data can infer from information about the past and present what is most likely to happen next, to look into the future. If armed conflicts, as I said before, involve a lot of moving pieces, then big data can inform where those pieces were, where they are now, how they interrelate, and even where they are likely to be next. This can enable belligerents to wage war more effectively, and since war involves killing people and breaking things, from a humanitarian perspective, this can be quite worrisome. The fact that the belligerents will be more effective at waging war is not necessarily a good thing for people on the ground. That being said, there's also a possibility that greater efficiency will result in less harm to civilians. And it's actually at this point that the law of armed conflict has something to say. Now, I realize not everyone listening in on this is an expert on the law of armed conflict, and obviously I won't have time to go into all the details of this body of law. It's quite comprehensive, but I do want to point out to some aspects that are relevant to the present discussion. So I'll give you a little bit of a rundown of the law of armed conflict in a nutshell. So the law of armed conflict is a body of law that states have agreed upon in order to regulate the conduct of the parties to armed conflict. Its underlying purpose is not a kind of utopian or pacifist goal of prohibiting war and related violence. Instead, it's a pragmatic body of law that accepts the unfortunate reality of war and also the need of the warring parties to pursue certain military objectives and military needs, but at the same time seeks for humanitarian purposes to prevent unnecessary suffering and to preserve some core human values. To that end, it imposes certain limits on permissible force. So the idea is to create a kind of balance between military necessity, military needs, which are accepted as something that militaries can legitimately pursue, and on the other hand, humanitarian considerations. So whenever something, use of force exceeds what's necessary for military purposes and causes humanitarian harm, then the law will intervene and try to introduce some constraints on the use of force. For present purposes, I want to highlight some elements of the architecture of the law of armed conflict, elements that are particularly relevant to consider when one is trying to assess the possible implications of big data. What I have in mind are, first, the fact that the law of armed conflict depends on classifications, and secondly, that it entails forward-looking evaluations, and all this has to be done within the fog of war that I referred to before. So if we begin with classifications, classifications are particularly important for determining who and what can be targeted and when they can be targeted, who can be the subject of an attack. The basic principle is easily stated. Civilians and civilian infrastructure are supposed to be off limits. Fighters and military objects can be attacked. And then there's some sub-categories that you have before you on the slide. Sometimes civilians taking part in hostilities can also be attacked. And there are certain circumstances in which fighters cannot be attacked. For example, when they're injured or when they've fallen captive, when they're basically outside the cycle of violence. Now, while it's simple to state these principles, in practice, the distinctions are often difficult to make, particularly under the trying circumstances of armed conflict, where life and death decisions have to be made very quickly. And the challenges are, of course, escalated in the nowadays common situations where the conflict involves non-state armed groups and all sorts of irregular forces who often don't look like fighters. They look very much like civilians. And also with the hostilities taking place not on a battlefield, but in and among civilian infrastructure and among civilians. So you have the military objects and civilian objects intertwined, the military personnel and civilians in close proximity, and now you have a challenge in trying to distinguish between the two. And when it comes to some of these categories, say an enemy soldier or a tank, there's a presumption that military needs will be served by attacking them. What that means is that once you've identified them, that they fall within the category, this is a soldier, this is a tank, you don't have to make any further evaluations and they can immediately be attacked. But in other cases, it's necessary to evaluate further whether the current or likely future use of an object and justify attacking it, and whether there's a military advantage to be gained by doing so. And now this becomes evident when you look at the definition of a military object, which is a rather complex definition. You have it before you on the slide. Just to pick out one element, so the term purpose relates to the expected future use. So you have to estimate, the belligerent has to estimate on the basis of the circumstances ruling in the present, whether destroying, say, a house that's expected to serve a military purpose in the future would offer a definite military advantage. Now, this is obviously not a simple exercise, particularly when decisions need to be made in the heat of battle. Outside the context of armed conflict, the law usually restricts state violence to circumstances of immediate necessity. And here I'm coming to the second observation I made before about future-orientated evaluation. So law in general, when it comes to the regulation of violence, allows state actors, state agents, to use lethal or potentially lethal force only as a last resort to prevent an imminent and weighty risk from materializing. So they're not allowed to speculate too far into the future. It's just when there's something really immediate happening now or about to happen in the immediate future that they can use force. Similarly, when it comes to depriving a person of their liberty, imprisoning them, this can only be done as a punishment for a criminal act that was committed in the past, not because of what we think someone might do in the future. So big data is used in criminal justice systems nowadays to take precautionary measures in advance to kind of identify areas where there's potential risk. But you don't actually throw someone in prison normally because you think they might do something in the future, something they haven't actually done yet. In the law of armed conflict, the situation is different. It allows force, including lethal force, to be used to prevent a future threat from materializing. So enemy fighters and military objects can be destroyed even when they're not posing an imminent threat. And the justification for that is that it's presumed or has been established that this could produce a military advantage. You strike at this tank, you'll gain a military advantage. You destroy this house that's going to be used by the enemy, you'll gain a military advantage, and you can do so even before they've actually used it to harm you or they're about to do so. Likewise, enemy fighters can be detained to prevent them from posing a future threat. So when it comes to soldiers, they can be placed as prisoners of war, they can be detained, and that isn't because of what they've done, but to remove them from the cycle of violence. A similar set of arrangements applies to other fighters who aren't soldiers operating for a state, but rather belligerents operating on behalf of an armed group, and also with respect to civilians. So the law of armed conflict allows civilians affiliated with the opposing party to be detained in certain circumstances when it's deemed necessary for military purposes, for security purposes. So not because of what they've done, but because of what they might do in the future to neutralize the threat. In addition to all this, the law of armed conflict often calls for judgment based on assessment of likely future outcome. We saw some indication of this when considering the definition of military object before, but it's even more pronounced when it comes to the application of the principle of proportionality in attack. You have the definition before you on the slide. Again, this is a rather complex kind of legal category. And what it calls on the person about the party about to launch an attack to do is to conduct a really complicated exercise where they have to evaluate against each other, on the one hand, the military advantage anticipated from striking at a military objective, and on the other hand, the expected incidental harm to civilians. So balancing these two against each other, military advantage anticipated against expected harm to civilians, is a very difficult exercise. I'm not sure big data will help with that. But what it will help, or could potentially help with, is actually just evaluating the two elements of this equation. Military advantage anticipated, that requires looking ahead into the future to evaluate on the basis of whatever data is available what advantages are expected from attacking a particular target, and then also assessing the incidental harm to civilians, what that's likely to be. And I suggested a moment ago that big data might be able to help here. What I think one has to say about big data is that it can operate as a double-edged sword when it comes to the implementation of the law of armed conflict. So I'm going to be talking about the perspective of a party to a conflict that actually respects the law of armed conflict. Obviously, that's not the case with all belligerents, and if they just want to use data to exert force without any restraint, then this isn't going to be very relevant for them. But states in particular often do want to at least seem to be seen to adhere to the law of armed conflict. And big data could facilitate more effective application of this body of law, and also better protection for civilians and civilian objects, better humanitarian protection. So I suppose the main way I see this materializing is in facilitating more accurate classifications and evaluations. We spoke before about the central role of classifications and evaluations in the law of armed conflict. So if you have more data on the basis of which to evaluate whether a person is a civilian or an enemy fighter, then you're likely to make more accurate decisions. The same is true of civilian objects. More accurate decisions would mean, in the hands of a party, again, that respects the law of armed conflict, less civilian casualties and less destruction of civilian objects. Attacks will be targeted only where they ought to be targeted. The same is true of detention of civilians. So if it's possible with rich data to ascertain more reliably who is likely to pose a military risk, then only those people will be detained, and cases in which civilians who don't pose a threat are detained will diminish. Assessments of anticipated military advantage, expected harm to civilians, all these forward-looking evaluations, they could probably be done more effectively if the evaluation was done on the basis of a richer analysis of data. So if more relevant data was captured, analyzed, it's quite likely that the evaluations would be more accurate. I mean, this is, in a way, common sense. More information accurately analyzed gives more accurate decisions. Also, with data captured, if it's recorded well, there will also be more options for ex post facto review of what the belligerents have done. At least internally, the armed forces will be able to theoretically review the actions of their forces and establish whether the decisions they made were lawful. Of course, the capacity to do that would depend on access. Only those parties with access to the information would be able to conduct such a review. Now, I said it's a double-edged sword, and I'm just going to point out to some possible risks that may arise. The first that I find disconcerting has to do with the risk of overextending the kind of preventative logic that exists in the law of armed conflict. So the idea that you can use force because of something that you foresee happening in the future is already a little bit troubling, as is the idea that you can detain someone because of something you think they might do in the future. But when human agents implement the law of armed conflict, they're not able to look far beyond the imminent or immediate risks. The kind of evaluations that people are capable of doing are relatively limited. But if you start having machines crunching big data, evaluating what's likely to happen in the future, there's a risk that there'll be a kind of minority report, for those of you familiar with the film, approach to the law of armed conflict. That is, you'll have all these assessments and decisions being made looking far into the future or analyzing a very broad array of data to reach conclusions about likely risks, and then on that basis using perhaps lethal force. And I'm concerned, at least, that when this starts happening, the force that will be unleashed will exceed that the original drafters of the law of armed conflict had in mind, and what the humanitarian underlying purpose of the law of armed conflict justifies. So it's one thing to recognize that in the fog of war, you have to, and when they're facing risks from an opposing armed force, you have to allow belligerents some leeway to use force to prevent harm being caused to them. But to transfer decisions or these kinds of preventative logic into the hands of machines that can look so much further into the future or analyze so much more data, I think that opens up possibly a Pandora's box, which we might very well want to keep closed. At least we have to give it quite a bit of thought. In the Israeli-Palestinian context, we're seeing a little bit of what this kind of algorithmic implementation of the law might lead to. So here we're seeing it in relation to detention. So Palestinians are placed in some cases under administrative detention, that is, under detention for preventative purposes. And increasingly you hear reports about cases where people are detained on the basis of an analysis of their activities online and other bits and pieces of information which are said to suggest that they pose a risk. In other contexts, and there's not very much transparency on this issue, but there's also reporting about decisions about targeting to conduct what are referred to as signature strikes that the U.S. Forces implement, and this is to some degree at the level of rumors, but there is talk about analysis of data, large bodies of data informing these signature strikes. So if a particular individual has been recorded as being next to other individuals who are suspect, conducting certain activities, purchasing certain goods, behaving in a certain way online, etc., etc., a lot of data is collected, and this reveals a kind of pattern that can, at least for the machine able to digest all this information, suggest likelihood that a particular individual poses a threat. Whether or not it's justified on that kind of basis to strike at someone, kill someone, deprive them of their liberty, is, I think, an issue that's at least questionable and requires further reflection. Now, another issue has to do with who's actually making the decisions. So big data is too big for the human brain to be able to process. Decisions in armed conflict, I've said this a few times during the talk, have to be made quite quickly. You have to respond to a threat rapidly. And for humans to assess big data in a reasonable time frame is often going to be impossible. Now, if we have machines that are capable of assessing this data, the question is, are we going to allow the machines to make the judgment calls that are relevant? And if not, how are humans going to be brought into the loop when, again, they're limited in their capacity to take in all the data in a relevant time frame? Now, this introduces ethical and philosophical questions. The idea that judgment on life and death issues, on human liberty, will be transferred to machines is one that many of us found troubling. I'm not going to attempt to delve into those ethical and philosophical questions here, but I think any reasonable person can understand that there's a lot of thought that has to be put in to these issues. But there are also practical concerns that arise. So, for example, the machine might make an error. It's looking through all this data, it's looking at data and identifying patterns based on past practices to make decisions that are future orientated, and it's likely that it might make mistakes. That's troubling when the result of that mistake might be that someone is killed. Also, even if the machines operate well, there is a risk that people will intervene and subvert the way the machines operate. So hacking, etc., are concerned. So there are these practical concerns that also arise and that we have to think quite carefully about before we allow machines to make judgment in situations of the law of armed conflict, before we turn the judgment that at present is left to warring parties and to human judges to pass that over to algorithms. Now, how we solve all those problems, how we deal with all them is, obviously a matter that will require a great deal of research, and this kind of work has already been begun in some places. I just want to point out to some areas where I think further thoughts and steps have to be taken or might need to be taken. So the rules of the law of armed conflict are very difficult to change, actually, because they're made by states, and you need states to agree on changing them, and it's not clear that it's going to be possible to change them to adapt to a reality where big data is affecting the implementation of the law of armed conflict, particularly as some states will have different interests than others. But somehow I think it is important, and for civil society as well, to push for a re-evaluation at least of the rules. And it might not require changing the rules, but perhaps adapting their interpretation so that some of the concerns that arise when big data is informing decisions regarding the application of the law of armed conflict are being made. So, for example, establishing clearer boundaries on the scope of inferences and forward-looking evaluations, permitting the use of force. So, at the moment, the scope of these inferences has been limited in a way by the limits of human beings. But now that we've got potentially more advanced ways of looking forward, we have to reflect again on how much we're going to allow this kind of forward-looking evaluation to permit the use of lethal force and also the deprivation of liberty. Thought has to be put into mechanisms for human control over the decision-making of the machines that are crunching the big data, the algorithms that are being used. Not clear how that's going to be done. As I said, there's a substantial challenge here in that people are not able to assess vast data very quickly. So some kind of mechanism where you are able to take advantage of the capacities of the machines, and yet there's a man in the loop or a woman in the loop making these decisions, I think is crucial and challenging. Now, lastly, when these decisions are being made by machines or by people working with machines, it's going to be very important to evaluate whether the decisions that have been reached are lawful, to take advantage actually of the fact that more data is available and recorded to assess, evaluate whether the law has been respected. And there, I think it's important to consider who is going to have access to the information. Now, obviously, in conflict, warring parties have legitimate interests in obscuring some information and keeping it secret. But on the other hand, in the interest of careful review of the conduct of hostilities, I think it's crucial that some bodies are identified that will be able to scrutinize all this data that's available and assess whether the law is being respected, whether humanitarian interests are being protected as they should be. Again, these are just initial thoughts. There's a great deal more work that has to be done here. I just wanted in this talk to kind of point to some of the concerns, causes for concern, and also the reasons for hope related to big data. And I look forward to hearing your questions. Thanks a lot. Hi, glad to be joining you live. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to receive them and to answer as best I can. If you do send questions, please do remember to add a hashtag @SecRev. As I said in my lecture, the topic is one that's actually at initial stages of research. I was mainly aiming to present questions for further inquiry. So, as I said, any questions that you may have would be greatly appreciated. If you're not seeing this live and you want to address a question to me, then please feel free to drop a question over by email. I can be reached at sam.e.diamond@gmail.com. So that's sam.e.diamond@gmail.com.
Hello to everyone. First of all, thank you for having me. This is a really interesting platform and unique way to bring us all together from obviously a variety of disciplines and studying a variety of topics. So my name is Michael Wolfowicz. I'm a research fellow at the Institute of Criminology and also at the Cybersecurity Research Center at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. I'm also the managing editor of the Journal of Quantitative Criminology. So today's talk, I want to talk about the issue of cyber radicalization. But when we talk about cyber radicalization, there's also a number of different issues related to this topic, which are all interconnected, and I want to try and bring them all together based on my current research. So I want to talk a little bit in the beginning, a little bit about online radicalization as an issue, the current state of the knowledge, of where we're at, what we know, what we don't know, and a little bit about what our current capabilities are and the current advances in automated detection, as well as some of the issues that exist with relation to automated detection tools and algorithms. After we go through this, I'll present to you the results of a recent study that we've just completed that was funded by the European Union Horizon 2020 framework. And I'll talk a little bit about how the results of this study may impact our approaches rather to automated detection and the role of big data. So I guess the main issue where we can start with this is that, well, unfortunately, we see that every few weeks, it seems, if not every few months, there are attacks taking place around the world, talking about, shall we call it the Western world or the democratic world, whether it be in North America or in Europe or here in Israel. And we often hear or see in the media statements by some security official or government representative that the attacker flew under the radar. And so, this is a very curious statement. If he flew under the radar, what does that mean? So we would essentially take it to mean that he was never on the radar to begin with. However, we usually see in the qualifying statements that these individuals at some point or another were under some sort of online surveillance, and that they flew under the radar is that there was no indication of, and I sort of paraphrase here the quotes that I'm used to seeing, or that we're used to seeing, that there was no indication that he had radicalized. Well, if that's the case, why was this person on the radar to begin with? Obviously, this was a person of interest who security or intelligence services at some point thought to be of some sort of a risk. And for one reason or another, when they moved from the online to the offline and carried out an attack, the security services missed the indicators, if there were any for that matter, that this was going to take place. So in trying to stop people from flying under the radar and identify them before they go on to carry out attacks, we have to actually take a step back and try and understand what is online radicalization, how does it operate, and why does it work the way it does. And as a result of answering those questions, how can we then go about using people's online activities and data to potentially prevent attacks before they actually occur. Obviously, this is a very pressing and politically charged issue, but all government agencies in the democratic world are engaging in some sort of online surveillance against potential threats. And so let's take a think about what we actually know about it. So I won't go too much into these definitions. But basically, online radicalization is the process where individuals, through their online interactions and exposures to various types of internet content, come to view violence as a legitimate method of solving social and political conflicts. So online radicalization, we all know it's a real thing. We hear about it all the time. But what's the actual effect? What effect does the online environment have on this multivariate equation that is radicalization, that leads somebody down the process or the pathway to carrying out an act of violence based on a radical ideology? So just in saying that, I'll just show you very, very quickly a study that will be published very soon. We did a meta-analysis of 22 factors. This was a systematic review that identified 22 factors, and we performed meta-analysis on factors of radicalization. This is radicalization of beliefs, not radicalization of actions. These are people holding radical beliefs, not actually going out to commit acts of terrorism. I'll explain that distinction and that dichotomy in a few moments, hopefully. So you can see here on this slide that social media exposure to radical social media has a small but significant effect. There's a number of factors that have a much larger effect than social media exposure on overall radicalization. Given the importance that we place on social media, this is maybe a smaller effect size than many people would like to hope for. However, one of the things that we can notice if you look at all of these other risk factors is that out of all of them, social media probably provides us with the best opportunity for early detection and possibly prevention. You can't sort of necessarily determine whether somebody is going to be married or not. You can't change the fact that somebody is an immigrant or not. You can't change how often somebody necessarily goes to a place of worship. But social media does provide us a window of opportunity that these other factors do not, even though it's relatively low on the scale of effect size. So what do we already know? Well, we know sort of what different types of activities occur on the internet and that are used by radicals and that are used by people trying to recruit radicals to carry out acts. But most recently, Paul Gill and colleagues carried out a study, and at the beginning of their study, they carried out systematic searches, and they identified that only 3 quantitative studies of online radicalization exist in the literature, and 2 of these studies were their own. So they identify here a few categories that the internet's role in radicalization include: communications, reinforcing prior beliefs, seeking legitimization for actions, disseminating and consuming propaganda, providing support groups, and for planning. I really take an issue with this, because which one of us doesn't use the internet for communications? Which one of us hasn't at some point read or consumed some part of information or content that doesn't support our pre-existing biases and beliefs? How many of us haven't gone online and maybe asked our friends, hey, I'm looking to decide to buy a new phone. Should I go for the newest iPhone or the newest Samsung Galaxy? Which one should I take? Or I'm considering maybe breaking up with a girlfriend. What do you think? People will use the internet to seek legitimization for a whole range of essentially mundane or innocuous behaviors. Disseminating and consuming propaganda, well, that's sort of unavoidable in this day and age, especially in the age of fake news, revolving around politics especially. We're constantly consuming propaganda, and many of us will share different articles that are often maybe one-sided and take part in the distributing of propaganda, even if it's essentially innocuous for the most part or non-radical. Many of us have been part or members in support groups for a range of things, whether they be family issues or support groups that people might join for a whole range of issues, health-related issues. And planning. How many of us haven't gone online to plan our next trip and decide what sites we're going to see or how we're going to get from the airport to our hotel? So all these activities that have been identified as playing a role in radicalization are the exact same set of activities that normative people take throughout the course of their normative internet use. So I want to take a big leap from that introduction into talking about automated systems. So automated systems, as we know, are based almost entirely, for the most part, on the analysis of keywords and phrases. They might perform sentiment analysis or other types of analysis, but for the most part, they are based on the analysis of keywords and phrases taken from one or more platforms and combined. So there's many good things that these tools have to offer. First of all, they use a range of integrated, highly technical and sophisticated methodologies, bringing together data mining, crawling, machine learning, and classification algorithms. So there's no doubt that they're highly sophisticated and advanced, methodologically speaking and technologically speaking. These are the types of systems that are being employed today by security services around the world, not just for radicalization, mind you, also for airport screening and other things as well. But of course, we're focused on the radicalization issue. And of course, these systems do something which the human analyst cannot, and that is to sift through the vast quantities of big data that are out there. However, they are not without their faults, of course, as we are becoming increasingly aware. These systems are highly sensitive to false positives and misclassifications. And as has been pointed out many times, both by the Department of Homeland Security, also Susskind wrote about this in the 1% doctrine, is that even only having 1% false positives could potentially lead to thousands of false arrests when you're dealing with populations of millions and millions of people that are under surveillance or whose data is included in these data sets that are being sifted through. Another issue is that when it comes to radicalization detection algorithms, they're based on almost entirely synthetic data. And they're also based on theoretical assumptions. You know, there's a saying that goes that the intelligence communities have all the data but don't know what to do with it, whereas the researchers have none of the data but know what to do with it. Well, most of the algorithms and automated detection tools have been built on synthetic data. They don't include data from actual terrorists who have actually gone out to carry out attacks. We simply have not been granted access to this data, to these data sources. With regards to the theoretical assumptions, well, I'll give you a quick example. I was at a meeting. I won't mention which of the companies, but shall we say that one of the largest tech companies in the world was presenting an advancement on their keyword and sentiment-based analysis, where they were introducing additional non-cyber related factors into the algorithm to increase its specificity and hopefully its power. And one of the things that they included in there was that they said that they were going to include education, and that individuals who have lower education will be essentially automatically classified as in a higher risk group in order to separate the groups between high risk and low risk. I couldn't hold myself back. I asked them on what basis did they decide that lower education was a risk factor, that this increased risk. And they basically responded, well, of course, everybody knows this, and this is a well-known thing. I referred them to the meta-analysis that we had conducted, which pooled together, just on education alone, had pooled together 11 studies, and which found that it's actually higher education that predicts an increased likelihood of turning to violent extremism. And there's actually a book that was just written about this by Diego Gambetta. I forget the name of the second author. I think the book was called something along the lines of Engineers of Jihad, the Curious Connection Between Higher Education and Terrorism. So this is just one example of these types of theoretical assumptions, which, we're talking about computer engineers here and computer scientists. You can't expect them to be fully up to date or aware of the different issues that might come about with such assumptions, and that they're making these assumptions in good faith and often based off of perhaps even the political considerations of the funders of their projects. So I'll just add a couple of other problems here. Obviously, the overwhelming majority of what we call radicals, or people we would consider to have radical views, they will never turn to violence. Only a very, very small percentage ever will, thankfully, that is. Most people who use the key words of interest, whether it be jihad or martyr or anything along these lines, they will never turn to violence. In fact, most of the people who are using these words The overwhelming majority will never turn to violence, and many of the people who do turn to violence have never used these words. It seems that what we can take away from all of this is that we still don't know how online radicalization works, and therefore the theoretical underpinnings of which factors to analyze, which are being built, which these automated detection tools are being built on, are already faulty from the outset. Another issue, which I'll get to very shortly, is that the automated detection tools that we have are also fundamentally flawed in two respects. And that is this. Number on the one hand, they seek to identify the radical population from the general population, whereas I hold that we should be seeking to identify the potentially violent radical population from the non-violent radical population. Secondly, they seem to think that what applies to radicals applies to terrorists, and that a terrorist is simply somebody who's just extremely radical. Well, this is simply not the case. Not all terrorists have been radicalized in the same, and not or especially radical for that matter. Just as I mentioned only a brief moment ago, not all radicals will become terrorists. Based on this, I think that we shouldn't be so surprised that some of the automated detection tools that are in use today by security services have been known to have false positives and false negative rates as high as 50%. So, just going back, I almost couldn't believe what I read in Gil's article, in Gil and colleagues' article, about there being only 3 quantitative studies on online radicalization. So I conducted my own systematic review, and I thought that this systematic review needs to be based on theory, and that the theory should reflect what our objectives are. So as I mentioned, our objectives are to differentiate between radicals and terrorists, not who are the radicals, but rather who are the terrorists amongst the radical population. So we adopted Macaulay and Moskalenko's 2 pyramid model, which I think reflects this very well. It also reflects very well the policies of the European Union, for example, have this distinction between radicalization and recruitment. Radicalization being the process of developing a certain set of beliefs and opinions and convictions, and recruitment being the actual engagement of actual illegal acts. So we identified only a very, very small number of studies, as you can see here. Only 5 studies which provided actual correlation or actual coefficients which could be pooled together. We identified 3 different variables related to online activity. So we identified exposure, just simple exposure, passive consumption, and posting activity, active engagement in radical content. There was a third variable that came up, which was exposure to radical traditional media. Which we thought made for a very interesting comparison, because you don't really know how big an effect size is unless you have something to compare it to. So as you can see here, exposure to radical social media actually has a slightly smaller effect size than exposure to radical traditional media. However, the main difference is in the active engagement, the posting activity. Here we see that there's a significantly larger effect size than simple passive exposure. So why would this be the case? So the 2 pyramid model gives us the model from which to differentiate between radicalization of belief and radicalization of behavior or actions, or cognitive radicalization and behavioral radicalization. But what functions may actually may lead from one to go from radicalization of belief to radicalization of action, or what factors may be able to differentiate between these 2 groups? We turn to social learning theory, which is one of the most established and empirically proven of the criminological theories. It's also a theory which is being increasingly used in the study of a variety of cyber deviance and cyber crime. And essentially, social learning theory is an extension of Edward Sutherland's originally differential associations theory, which essentially looks at deviant peers. That is, that the greater that our peers or our networks are in favor of offending behaviors, or any behavior for that matter, as opposed to the other opposing opinions, that increases the likelihood that we will adopt these beliefs and or behaviors. There's some additional components that were then later added by Akers: differential reinforcement, imitation, and definitions. Differential reinforcement essentially being that if I profess my support for engaging in a certain behavior, that my peer group will support me in that, or provide me with reinforcement and agreement for engaging in that particular behavior. Then there's, of course, imitation. If my friends smoke, so I'm more likely to smoke. The number one predictor for criminality after previous criminality, that is having friends who are criminals themselves. So we see this online as well, that having online peers that are engaging in a particular behavior greatly increases the likelihood that we will also participate in that behavior. It has been already theorized, and to some degree there's quite a bit of evidence to support this, that the peer network effect is much stronger online than it is offline. So we sought to see how could we apply social learning theory to online radicalization. And as you can see here, we took each of the social learning variables, and we found that they each had measurable Facebook metrics which they could be connected to. So the first one, differential associations or deviant peers, we measured this in our study, which I'm about to present to you now, as a dichotomous variable, which measured whether or not an individual had posted a mention of a friend or a family member from their network who had committed a terrorist attack prior to their own, or within the time frame in which we collected the data from them. We also looked at frequency, which was measured simply as the post per day, the average post per day during the time frame, to measure what was the frequency of active activity that they had. We looked at imitation, and we looked at this by the ratio between original posts and shared posts, and different types of original posts. And we measured intensity by the ratio between radical and non-radical posts. For the most part, people still use their online, even the most radicals will still use a proportion to varying degrees of their social media activity to post essentially personal or essentially innocuous content. And then we measured differential reinforcement in the three different ways that Facebook has to offer: likes, comments, and shares. So for our study, we gathered data on 46 lone wolf terrorists whose profiles remained fully open and public, and that Facebook had not taken them down prior to their attack. This was out of a data set that we had from a prior study on lone wolves of over 300 lone wolves. We found that 46 of them still had these profiles. It took a lot of manual searching, using a team of Arabic-speaking researchers to identify these profiles and manually extract the data. We did not use any data scraping techniques. We manually extracted the data of 100 days prior to their attack. We subsequently went into their networks, and using the graph search function, we created matches for them. We identified friends or family members of theirs who were the same age, same gender, from the same hometown, and in some cases from the same school, who were also evidently radical based on the content that they share on their timelines, on their Facebook profiles. The only difference being that they're still actively posting. They have not gone on to carry out acts of terrorism. So in saying that, I'll jump straight to the results. I'll briefly describe is that the single greatest effect was found for differential associations. That was that the terrorists are more likely to post about a friend or family member who have committed an attack prior to their own. I'll go on to the implications about that shortly after I go through the rest of these results. We see that posts per day, likes per post, comments per post are not significant. There's no significant differences between the terrorists and the nonviolent radicals. Where we do see a difference here is in shares per post received. That is that the terrorists have received a far larger number of shares on their posts than their nonviolent radical counterparts do. The next two variables which were significant were text post and video post. You'll see here, however, that the coefficients are negative. This means, and we'll discuss this momentarily, that the terrorists are less likely to post text-based posts. The larger proportion of text-based posts are characteristic of the nonviolent radicals. And the same is the case with video-based posts. And this is extremely important for what we're basing our assumptions on and how we're developing our automated detection tools. So with regards to differential associations, this provides us some very important direction. It means that when somebody carries out a terrorist attack, the people who are at the highest risk of imitating them are people in their own network who have posted about the attack. So if a person goes out to carry an attack and they have 1,000 Facebook friends and only 2 of them have actually posted about that friend's attack, they have their odds of carrying out an attack on their own following their friends or family members' attack is quite large. That really narrows down the pool of who we need to be looking at, who are considered to be at the highest risk. And I think that that's going to be an extremely important, that should be an extremely important guiding piece of information for both automated detection tools and for the way that we carry out surveillance more generally. With regards to the shares, why not likes, why not comments, why shares? So it's already been theorized that people that receive more shares, why do they receive more shares? What makes them receive more shares than their friends? Well, it's because their networks consider them to be opinion leaders. And very often they consider themselves to be opinion leaders too. It's a sort of cause and effect with regards to this. And this leads to another theory, which is the attitude behavior consistency, that attitudes significantly and substantially predict future behavior, and that there's a sort of expectation, therefore, that, well, if people are sharing my content a lot, I'm considered an opinion leader. I consider myself an opinion leader, and there's a sort of expectation that my network has of me and that I have of myself, for that matter, to act in accordance with the way that I'm viewed. With regards to the lack of text-based posting, other studies using even smaller data sets have found that terrorists, while not reflective of IQ or intelligence whatsoever, tend to show a lower cognitive sophistication in their posting activities and the things that they do right. So it seems that the terrorists are engaging in more sharing behaviors, which seems to be more characteristic of users, of changes in patterns and trends in users' activities more generally, whereas the nonviolent radicals seem to be engaging in more text-based posts. In this regard, it's actually been theorized previously that by providing an essentially nonviolent outlet to voice their grievances and perhaps feel that they're contributing in a nonviolent way, or perhaps that they're contributing in the way that they can best contribute to the cause, shall we say, that increased social media activity can actually potentially act as a preventative factor against violent extremism. I'll just sort of skip some of these conclusions and jump right to the end. While online radicalization is evidently only one factor in this multivariate equation of radicalization, it seems that utilizing small, high-quality data sets are what should inform how we approach big data, and not the other way around. And this seems to me what's happened. We've sort of almost jumped the gun. I was just reading an article the other day that ICE in America, have already abandoned their artificial intelligence and algorithm-based approaches to detecting potential terrorists. And I think that the reason for this is understandable. They've started off from a faulty, non-evidence-based, theoretical, assumption-based premise to begin with. And therefore, it shouldn't be surprising that the approach doesn't work. Chan and Bennett Moses discuss this issue in their article, Is Big Data Challenging Criminology? And essentially they make similar conclusions, which is that we should not be abandoning our traditional small data approaches to identifying which characteristics may be able to differentiate between offenders and non-offenders. Rather, these small data studies, like the one that I just presented to you, should inform how we develop big data approaches to big data and how our automated detection tools are developed, and not have the big data make the determinations for us about small data problems. Because as mentioned before, this is a small data problem. We are talking about a very, 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 very small percentage of potentially threatening individuals who are coming from a pool that is essentially a very, very small pool of individuals from a very, very small segment of the general population. So we really, really need to narrow this down, both theoretically and also based on the type of factors that we're looking at. And in seeing that that the terrorists are are less likely to post text-based posts, that is, we need to move away from this keyword and phrase-based analysis and maybe move more towards a meta-analytic approach. In saying that, and I think that this is something that we need to really take to heart, AI and big data is not there to replace the analyst. It is there to assist the analyst in making hard, difficult, very, very potentially life-altering decisions, legal decisions, criminal justice-based decisions. It's there to help them. It's a tool to assist them to make their job a little bit easier and to make them a little bit more confident, perhaps, in making the decisions whether or not somebody will be picked up off of the street by security forces. And I think that we should really think about abandoning this idea and this desire to have AI and big data replace the need of the analyst. It's there as a tool to assist them, to work in conjunction with them, just as other weapons that might be used by security forces. We don't fully automate them, and there's certainly a big push against any ideas of fully automating them. They're a tool to enable the human operators to perform their job more effectively, more actively, and to reduce the number of false positives and to maintain the ethical and human rights requirements to the utmost degree while still being able to carry out their jobs most effectively. So I'll leave it there. I will say is that we have already, I will actually make one last comment briefly. We have already built some preliminary machine learning models to try and see how do our evidence-based models, or models based on actual real data of actual terrorists, compare to the tools that are currently out there on the market being sold to and used by security agencies all around the world. So I will just say this very briefly. The logistic regression model that I showed you now, the predicted classification overall was 80.6%. I will say that it was much larger for the non-violent radicals than the violent radicals. It only predicted 68.9% accuracy for the radicals. The area under the curve was 0.859. However, classification is a fairly simple CART model using classification and regression trees we achieved. And this is only the preliminary model, mind you, 88.9%, almost 9% more than the logistic regression model. And the correct prediction for the violent, for the terrorist, was 86.7%. This gave us an area under the curve of 0.919. We also have been playing around with neural networks. Probably because of the size of the data where we're currently at, and we are constantly building this data, constantly adding to it on a daily basis. The neural network model is still underperforming compared to the classification and regression tree model. But we will continue to work with a variety of models. Our goal is to develop an evidence-based model, or a series of evidence-based models, which we can then test them simultaneously as well as retroactively in order to identify which ones might be most effective. I will say that across all models, the same variables are consistently found to be of the most important. That is the differential associations, posting about a friend or family member who has already committed an attack, the increased number of shares per post received, a lack of or a smaller proportion of text-based posts, a smaller proportion of video-based posts. In the CART model, we have also identified that posts per day, a higher number of posts per day, that is of shared posts and picture-based posts, may also be a strong predictor of differentiating between terrorists and their nonviolent counterparts. So that is the direction in which we are moving and developing these studies, which we've been carrying out. And yeah, I think that's I've basically probably stretched out my time as much as I can at this point, and I hope you all enjoyed, and I'm looking forward to your questions and opening up the discussion. Thank you.